change, ye faithful will remain. Be still, my soul, thy best, thy heavenly friend. Through thorny ways leads to a joyful end. Be still, my soul, thy God doth undertake to guide the future as he has the past. Thy hope, thy confidence, let nothing shake. All now mysterious shall be bright at last. Be still, my soul, the waves and winds still know his voice who ruled them while he dwelt below. Be still, my soul, the hour is hastening on, when we shall be forever with the Lord. When disappointment, grief, and fear are gone, sorrow forgot, love's purest joys restore. Be still, my soul, when change and tears are past. All safe and blessed we shall meet at last.
Be strong and courageous and do not be afraid. The Lord goes with you each and every day. He'll never forsake you. Don't be afraid. He'll never forsake you. Don't be afraid. The Lord goes before you through the trouble and strife, and He will protect you all the days of your life. He'll never forsake you. Don't be afraid. He'll never forsake you. Don't be afraid. Be strong and courageous and do not be afraid. The Lord goes with you each and every day. He'll never forsake you. Oh, don't be afraid. He will never forsake you. Don't be afraid. He'll never forsake you. Oh, don't be afraid. He will never forsake you. Don't be afraid. He'll never forsake you.
My soul finds rest in God alone. Salvation comes from Him. My hope is found in God alone, and we will trust in Him. In God we trust. In God we trust. refuge and my song, a fortress found in God alone, and He will keep us strong. In God we trust. In God we trust. In God we trust. In God we trust. He rules the world in righteousness. We follow His command. One nation under God above, with Him will always we will stand. My soul finds rest in God alone. Salvation comes from Him. My hope is found in God alone, and we will trust in Him. In God we trust. In God we trust. In God we trust. In God we trust.
Some trust in the chariot,
We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
some trust in horses.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
His love never fails, His name will always prevail.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
Some trust in the work they do.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
By His grace all the work is through.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
His love
Never fails. His name will always prevail. We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
Some trust in the wealth of things.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
Name worth more than anything.
We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
His love
Never fails. His name will always prevail. We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God. We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
His
Love never fails. His name will always prevail. We trust in the name of the Lord our God.
Well, I'm Russ Corley, and it's an honor to be invited by the Lancaster family to be a part of the Praise and Harmony channel and to speak to you today. And so I want to talk today about the book of Job, but to give you just a little bit of background, because I'm not sure when you'll be watching this, but in Tennessee over the last few months, it's been a kind of a crazy time. So a few months ago, before COVID-19 kind of descended on us, there was a tornado that swept through Nashville. So you had this natural disaster. Then you had COVID-19 that kind of embraced all of us as a country and around the world and all that. And then now in the United States, you have all kinds of protests and riots because of the George Floyd death, and a lot of people concerned about issues about justice and injustice and racism and all that. And so I've done a lot of thinking over the last few months and speaking to my church at Madison about the problem of suffering. And so if you really want to kind of look at the problem of suffering, one of the best places to go is the book of Job. And one of the things I want to make really clear is this, that what I'm talking about today is not going to solve all your questions about suffering. I think what suffering does do is it raises a lot of issues and things we'd like to have answers for. But very often, no one seems to be able to do that. And it's kind of a comfort to find the book of Job, which is 42 chapters long, and you would think that in 42 chapters you would kind of get everything nice and neat and wonderful and beautiful. And that's not really quite what you get. Instead, what you get is dramatic dialogue that you are invited to read and become a part of. So if you ever dealt with Plato's dialogues, his Socratic method, he has these characters that are inviting you to think with the writer, but they don't give you the answers. Instead, your thinking sometimes is made far more complicated because about the time somebody articulates your answer, somebody else comes along and messes with it. Usually that's Socrates. That's kind of his role to show you that you're not nearly as wise as you think you are. So long before Socrates and Plato was writing his dialogues, you have the book of Job written, and it's dealing with this problem of suffering. Now, what I'm going to do today is to kind of give you what I would call the Dummies Guide to Job. You know, there's that series of books called Dummies for Chess or Dummies for whatever the topic might be. And you and I would both be naive if we thought that all you had to do was read that book and then you got it. You'd know exactly what you need. I find those books helpful. They give you an introduction and kind of the contours of the problem. And what they do, I think, is invite you to explore more. And they kind of give you guidance for that, but they certainly are not the final answer. So what I'm going to do today is no final answer. I'm going to try to invite you to think about Job, kind of the large structure of what's going on in the book of Job, and that might help you to go through it some and think about some. And one of the things I would suggest is that you do this. Think about the book of Job as an extended parable. And so very often when parables are being told, like when Nathan the prophet comes to David after David's committed adultery with Bathsheba, Nathan tells him a parable. And David identifies himself, didn't realize it's himself yet, but he identifies himself with one of the characters, and he's very angry with what he sees that character doing. And that's when Nathan turns to him and goes, well, you're the man. That's you. So let's talk just a little bit about the book of Job and see what we can find as we do that. So the first two chapters of the book of Job are they're prose. Almost the rest of the book until you get to the very end is poetry. And when you're dealing in those first two chapters, there are three statements made about Job, and they're all in agreement about Job. And this is really important. If you don't have this as your anchor as a reader, you're going to be confused. And Job can be confusing at times. But without this anchor, you're really going to be confused. So once the writer says something like this, and twice God says this about Job, and this is what God says. He's actually in heaven. There's this heavenly council. He's talking to Satan, and he's asking Satan this question: have you seen my servant Job? There's no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. So you can find that in chapter 1, verse 8. In chapter 2, verse 3, God is making a similar statement after Satan has made his first attack on Job. And God lets Satan know that Job has not lost his integrity as a person. Now, the reason that's important is this. If you're familiar with the book of Job and the story, there is great suffering going on in Job's life. And here's the bottom line. He's done nothing to deserve it. And that's going to be very important as we read along. Now, one of the things I find is there are these different responses to Job. So Job is the central character, and you got all these people all around him who are talking. And very often, that's the kind of thing that happens when something bad in the world happens and people are suffering. Everybody starts scratching their heads and going, why do you think that is? And then we give our little solutions. And so here are kind of the three big solutions that are offered in the book of Job. In chapter 2, you find Mrs. Job. And she comes along and she's seeing this kind of tidal wave of horrible things. So Job has lost all their financial stuff, is gone. Their 7 children, dead. And that was kind of the first wave. And then it gets even more intense. And now Job is boils all over his body. He's suffering. He's miserable. He's on an ash heap. Life is bad. And Satan, both before God, had said, you know, if you just let me expose him to suffering, he'll curse you and die. So Miss Job comes along, and it's just very brief, but all of a sudden she just finally goes, are you going to just continue to try to maintain your integrity? Why don't you just curse God and die? And so that's kind of the big solution to the problem of evil and suffering in the universe. If there's a good God who's all powerful and these bad things happen, Well, they shouldn't be happening. And so if they are happening, it must not be a God. And Mrs. Job, basically that's what she's saying is you just need to forget your integrity, forget trying to trust in God anymore, just curse him and die. Job refuses to do that. Basically his idea is, why should we be the kind of person who receives blessing from God, but when bad things happen to us, we don't also receive them? He's God and we are not. And so he disagrees with her. But it's important for us all to see that this problem of suffering, especially suffering that doesn't make sense, is a big problem. And once you begin to think about it, it leaves you very uncomfortable. Now, one of the things I will say is this, is Job responds to his wife and refuses to agree with her. So he will not take her stance. He's going to continue to trust in God and believe in God. And he's saying, I trust him. He's given me so much good. I'm going to trust him now. As time goes on in the story, he's struggling a lot more. As time goes on in the story, you discover that this is a very difficult journey for him, and he gets very frustrated. Now, part of the reason he gets frustrated is this: it doesn't just go away. So this is not any short-term crisis. So for any of you who were quarantined for a few months with COVID-19 and kind of waiting around and getting bored with that, or sometimes finding something you could do, but then that will kind of wear thin. One of the things we all, I think, realize is a short-term crisis can be bad enough. But when it stretches out over a period of time, the kind of short-term answers become more problematic. So for example, if you get sick and feel miserable and all that, but then you get better, well, then you can kind of be strong for a little while, but when it stretches out into a chronic situation or gets worse and worse, or you go through all these treatments and things don't quite work out the way you'd hope, then over time, there's kind of this challenge that emerges. So that brings you to the second part of the book, and that begins in chapter 3. It actually begins in Job talking some about his suffering. But in that section of the book, from chapter 3 through, I think it's 37, you have these dialogues where people are encountering Job, and the first long set of dialogues are with 3 of his friends, and basically you have one will speak, then Job will speak. The next one will speak, Job will speak. The next will speak, Job will speak. Round 1, round 2, the same pattern. Round 3, the third pattern of that, except for the third friend doesn't speak at the end of round 3. But they each speak, and every time they do, Job answers them. And this is the thing we have to realize. His friends, first of all, when they show up, they just sit with him in silence for a week, which is probably a good thing. But after about a week, I don't know if it's just their silence or not doing anything. I'm not quite sure what goes on, but finally Job in chapter 3, he speaks. And when he does, it triggers something deep inside them because he's kind of questioning, is this really fair? What's going on? So then they start to respond, and my guess is you've done that too. Somebody will say something that makes you feel uncomfortable. It seems like they're questioning God. And so if you're not careful, all of a sudden you've got these little passages in the back of your head, some kind of theological ideas that seem so right to you, so clear, so true. And these 3 friends, that's what's going on with them. They're theological. They're very confident. They've kind of worked out their system. They've got biblical reasons for saying this, because when I tell you their solution, you'd be able to go, well, yeah, there are those passages that seem to say that. And this is what it does. So the answer to the question is basically this kind of presupposition. God is a good God. If you are good, God's going to bless you. If you're bad, God's going to punish you. And if you don't like the punishment, get right with God again, and He will bless you again. And that's kind of the formula that they're using. And part of what's going on is that formula is very clear to them. And let's all admit, sometimes the formula fits. I've been in situations, my guess is you've been in situations where you've done something and the clear consequences of what you have done has caused you suffering and maybe other people to suffer too. And then you feel terrible. You go, why did I do that? You like to go back and reverse that. And so their kind of theory or theology of suffering kind of fits those cases where you have been living close to God and all of a sudden you're in rebellion against God and then these consequences happen. And that's basically what they keep arguing and arguing. The problem is this. Remember the theological answer I gave you a little while ago, or the theological anchor? That is, Job is a man who's blameless. He has fear of God. He does everything he can to be right. As it gets on further in the book, you find he is concerned about justice in society, the poor. He gives to the poor. There's all this stuff about him. He's a man of great integrity. He was even making sacrifices for his children. They would have these parties, and the morning after, he would sacrifice in case something wrong had gone on at the party. He'd be making sacrifice for them. He was pretty obsessive about this relationship with God and doing things that were right and pleasing to God. So his friends will make these kind of suggestions that were a little bit more than that, because every time Job says, no, that's not right. You see, they'd be giving this answer, and Job would listen, but as he listened, what he knew was there was nothing he could find that he had done that was deserving of these kinds of consequences that were really bringing this into his life. It's a little bit like if you've been in Tennessee when the tornado came. Well, there's really nothing that you did to make that tornado hit your house or take the life of your child or those kind. It didn't make sense. It just it happened. There have been terrible accidents that people have been involved with that it wasn't their fault. They didn't do anything. It just happened. It could have been some type of corporate responsibility, and something was unanticipated suddenly is showing up, or war comes down, descends on you as all that stuff. So there are a lot of situations where it just doesn't quite seem fair, the suffering that's emerging. And Job is pretty confident. But a lot of us, well, we don't really like when people disagree with us. So as Job is disagreeing with the friends, they get more fired up. And suddenly it's kind of this long, extended dialogue, 3 against 1, where they're very intense and very insistent that Job is wrong and that they are right. And that it becomes very difficult for Job. Now, finally, when they get done, and apparently these are older guys, because towards the end of the book, I think it's in chapter, in chapter 32 through 37, there's this young guy who shows up, Elihu. He shows up, and he is young, he's eloquent. As a matter of fact, the first chapter of his speeches is kind of the introduction. I mean, he goes on a long time, and basically in that introduction he says this: I've been listening to you old guys, and you've been talking, and you're not nearly as smart as you think you are. You've not been able to refute Job when he answers you. You've not been able to refute him. You've not been able to change his mind. And I'm young, I know I'm young, but, well, I'm wise too, and I got answers. And so suddenly this kind of young guy is looking at these older guys and he's going, your theology is inadequate. I'm more sophisticated. I know what I'm doing. So now he tears into Job, and he's got his solutions for Job. And he goes on and he goes on. And the interesting thing is, I don't think he realizes it, but often he's echoing what they have said to Job, but he's not quite aware of it. It reminds me a little bit of this. I think a lot of times in the Christian world, you have older Christians who've been saying things in a certain way, and so there are people who've listened to them and kind of become very familiar with that. And they got a little bored with that. They really haven't done theological reflection going, that just doesn't quite work. Instead, what you have is they don't like. So this young person comes along and goes, they're crazy. They don't know what they're talking about. But I do. If you just listen to me, I've got the answers that you need. And so they start talking. And very often one of the things I found is sometimes, not always, but sometimes you get younger people who, because they really want to somehow attract people in a larger cultural arena, they begin to adapt their theological understanding. They begin to adapt in such a way that sounds a lot more like culture, and begins to provide the answers that you would find at a university, within an academic environment. And they try to say it, and people go, well, yeah, that makes sense to me. And suddenly they kind of are becoming that vocal answer. But what you find when you read Elihu is that he doesn't have the answer either. Now, in the middle of all this, so you got Mrs. Job, you got the 3 friends, and you got the young buck who's kind of assisting. And when I listened to him, one of the things I thought about too is when I was in graduate school at Ohio State, there were a lot of people who were very bright, and they were younger than the professors. But one of the things I found was they had a lot of language. They could talk a long time about things. And for the first 2 months, I was very intimidated. I thought, I don't belong here. I'm not this smart. They have all these words, epistemology, ontology, all this kind of stuff. And okay, I don't know what all that means. I'd read books. I couldn't understand what I was reading. And they're always using this language. I go, well, they're just so brilliant. And then I learned, after a little while, that a lot of times they didn't even know really what they were saying. They had been almost converted into a community of language. They had their slogans. They had their way of talking. It all sounded very coherent. But if you really started to ask them questions, you found that it was a very thin veneer, and it too was a problem. And so you find all these things going on in the book of Job, but then right there in the middle of the book of Job, you got Job. And he's listening to all this, and he's trying to make sense of it, and he's got feelings, and nobody's very empathetic with him. It's not like they're looking at suffering and they really are identifying with that. How could you? If you've never lost your children, how could you identify with that? If you've never been completely bankrupt and everything wiped out, how could you? And he's both those things. And his suffering doesn't seem to have anything to do with something he did that brought it about. So it's the really very deep puzzle, and none of it, the people around him are very empathetic. Now maybe Miss Job is. Maybe because she suffered too. It was her children too. It was all that financial loss. So maybe she's empathetic, but her answer to that is just give up on God, just die. It's over. This has just been such a waste. Now she may have changed her mind later. We don't know. She just has a very small role, small part in the story. But in the middle of this, Job is really struggling, and his suffering, I think, is made worse because the people who are trying to answer him don't have answers, and they are accusing, and their solutions are very difficult. Now, one of the things Job thinks is, if I could just get in front of God, I got some questions for God. If I could get in front of God, I have some things I'd like to say to him. Now, my guess is if you've ever been in a situation of suffering or just some of the perplexities of life, you too have probably had that feeling. Like, when I die, I've got some questions for God. And Job kind of has that sense. Until you get to the part in the book of Job in chapter 38 where God shows up. Well, when God shows up, suddenly you find that Job doesn't seem to have a real passion for all of his questions. Now, why is that? A little bit early in the book of Job, there's a chapter, I think it's 29, where there's this whole section about what man knows and what he doesn't know. And one of the things that man doesn't know in his own strength is real wisdom about God. And that chapter ends with this idea that the wisdom of God requires the fear of God. That sense of having an awesome wonder about God, being humbled in the presence of God. And for a lot of us, we have kind of easy ideas about God. Well, he's loving and he's forgiving us and all that kind of stuff. And we're just kind of so casual about God. And a lot of times we borrow that way of talking from the world, not from Scripture. Because if you really work with Scripture very long, you go, whoa, every time people get in the presence of God, something happens. You look at Moses the burning bush or on Mount Sinai. You look at Isaiah in chapter 6. You look at the book of Revelation when all this is being revealed to people and they just bow down and worship. Well, when you get to the end of the book of Job, God and Job are kind of face to face as it is. And Job is now in God's presence. And so God knows what Job has been asking, but he doesn't give any answers to the questions. Now that may be pretty frustrating to you as a reader because you kind of go, well, really, I was hoping all this work that finally somebody would solve all this for me. Well, God didn't do that. Instead, what God does do is he begins to ask questions of Job. It's really interesting because he goes, so where were you when I created all this? Who do you think you are? Do you understand this? Do you understand this? And he starts lining up all kinds of things that Job, nor you, nor I could explain, fully understand. Because every time you begin to think you've understood it, some scientists go, well, that's really not quite the way it works. Because a lot of times when we talk about nature or the universe or all that, we use words like quantum or the Big Bang or all that kind of stuff. And if a scientist were to hear us talk about that, they would kind of go, so what does that mean? And then you kind of go, oh, well, I got that word. So what you have is this. God shows up in the story, and Job's response is not what he thought it would be. Let me read to you two of the spots where Job finally responds to God. So in those chapters, you have this kind of long, where God speaks to Job for quite a while, and then he kind of gets silent. So in chapter 40, so that's at the end of God's speech in chapters 38 and 39. In chapter 40, beginning verse 1 through 5, you find the Lord said to Job, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. And then Job answered the Lord, I'm unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. And then God starts speaking again. So, if you're like me, you almost feel like a child who the parent has now confronted the child, and you thought it was all over, and you're kind of going, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have done that. What was I thinking? And then the parent goes on again. So God goes on again for another 2 chapters. And finally, in chapter 42, 1 through 6, it says, then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me. And then Job says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. So you see what's going on? Job has all these questions that are legitimate questions, or the questions that we as humans ask. But suddenly when he's in the presence of God, he recognizes that he's not really qualified or capable to understand God. If you're familiar, in Isaiah 55, there's a section in that beautiful chapter where God talks to, through Isaiah, he says he wants the wicked to leave their ways, the unrighteous their thoughts, and turn to God. And then he goes on, makes this point that our ways are not his ways, his thoughts are not our thoughts. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are his ways above our ways, his thoughts above our thinking. And I think we tend to forget that. That's why in the book of Job, where you have that chapter, I believe it's 28, maybe 29, but that chapter where you find the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I think for many of us who are followers of Jesus, we need to remember that without the presence of Christ with us, to be brought into the presence of God would be a fearful thing. To be brought in the presence of God, in the presence of Christ, is apparently this profound experience of love. But if we're not careful, we become so casual, and we forget all the greatness of forgiveness and this relationship we have with God. Now, that's one of the things I do want to, as we kind of come to the end of what we're talking about, one of the things I want you to think about is, so if we take the book of Job as a parable, one of the things I think we should remind ourselves of is this. Job points us to one who is greater. So you see all this suffering that Job endures. You see him standing before God, and when he comes before God, he humbles himself. Well, when you get to the New Testament, you find the one who's greater than Job. You find the one who was always in the presence of God, and according to Philippians chapter 2, leaves that sense of intimate face-to-face presence with God and becomes one of us. He chooses a life of unfair suffering. It was not something imposed on him. Instead, as an act of love, the Father and the Son working together, The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. It's as if what we find in Jesus is this living answer to our question. Even still, it doesn't satisfy all of our questions, but it's the living answer to this great, deep, profound mystery. And what you find is, in the coming of Jesus Christ, he takes up all the suffering, mine and yours and ours, and he faces his own suffering. Because the thing that you find is that because he has been so faithful to the Father, he's rejected by so many. The power establishment in Jerusalem and in Rome, as it's represented in Pilate, reject him. He's arrested unfairly. He's done nothing wrong. He goes through this trial before the Sanhedrin, and then they bring him before Pilate. And Pilate even says, I can't find any reason to crucify. What is all this? We just need to let him go. But the political pressures, see the unjustness of all that? And the next thing you know, he's being turned over to the strong arm of the Roman government soldiers. And what they do is they brutally beat him, unfair. Then they nail him to the cross, that most cruel form of torturous execution, capital punishment. He's crucified there with those others who deserve to be treated that way because of things they have done, their rebellion against Rome, but not him. And in the middle of all this, you have to remember that in the garden, because Jesus was fully human as well as fully divine, 3 times he prayed before the Father, let this cup pass from me. Suffering was suffering to him. And the suffering he was about to endure was overwhelming. And so he asked, well, let this pass from me, but not my will, your will be done. So he's praying to the Father. And his prayer was not answered the way he wanted it. I mean, his desire was the cup would pass from him. So on the cross, what you find is, there's that statement where that experience of darkness is so complete, abandonment, all that. You find Jesus at one moment of the cross going, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think Job felt that way. Jesus felt that way on the cross because there he was carrying the burden of our sin, which was, he was bearing the consequences for something he had not done for us. But that's not the only word he spoke from the cross. He looked at those who had crucified him unjustly, and he says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And at the very end, he prays another prayer to the Father. Just like he prayed in the garden, let this cup pass from me. There he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And you had these soldiers at the foot of the cross, the guys who had driven the nails into the hand, maybe the same guys who had flogged him so brutally before all that. And it says that one of them says, surely this must be the Son of God. So it's one of the curious, beautiful, profound things that I don't still understand. And I'm getting older, but it's not that as you get old, wisdom comes. So that's where Elihu is right. Just because you're old doesn't make you wise. And just because you're young doesn't make you brilliant. But one of the things you see is that suffering and love, when they move together in the presence of God, something profound happens. So yes, there's one greater than Job, but even now, for thousands of years, people have been reading the book of Job. His story of suffering, the questions he raises, the faithfulness of all that. We still come back to that, and we're, number one, glad we're not him. And number two, he engages us so we begin to think about these things together. It is interesting in the book of Job, one of the things that it does talk about is after God has confronted Job and really praises Job overall for what he's done, the 3 friends who had been so confident that they had the answers and Job was wrong, God's angry with them. And God challenges those 3 men and they say, you come to Job, he can offer sacrifice for you and be your mediator because you've sinned against me and what you've done has made me angry. So once again, even in that book of Job, you have him prefiguring Jesus, the one greater than Job, who once again enters into this suffering with love and trusting the Father and bringing something good out of something that seems so horrible. Both Job and Jesus were constantly learning to trust in the goodness of God. In Job, one of the lines that, probably the first line I learned from Job was when he says, "Even though he slay me, I will trust him." So as we kind of come to a close of this kind of whirlwind overview of Job, one of the things I want you to be thinking about is this. In Psalm 23, and a lot of you have memorized that, you know it, there comes that little section there in the King James Version where it says, "Yea, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Well, why? It says, "Because you're with me, and your rod and your staff, they comfort me." You see this image of the shepherd who is taking care of the sheep who really are not very smart, and they don't get why they have to do some things that to them would be experienced as suffering and difficulty, but they follow the shepherd. And I think that psalm invites us to continue to be in the presence of Jesus, even when we're weary and burdened and life doesn't make sense. And one of the things I think that you maybe someday will be invited to do, I think I've been at times invited to do, is to step into a situation where someone else is suffering as an opportunity to mediate the love of Jesus Christ. Not to come up with all the answers, not to make everything better, but to suffer with someone in love. To be the presence of Christ with someone who has questions they can't answer. Not to reject them, not to try to solve everything for them, but to care for them beyond words. You know, one of the things I remember, and I'll close with this, years ago, a young athlete at Lipscomb died with cancer. He was a great baseball player, had prospects of playing professional baseball, but the cancer took him out very early. I remember working with him in the hospital for a long time. I spoke at his funeral. And when I spoke at his funeral, one of the other people speaking, the head pastor of a church there, got up and basically said something that just made me cringe. I kind of wanted to walk off the stage because he started going, well, you know, he was a great pitcher, but he never pitched a no-hitter, and now he's in heaven and he's pitching no-hitters in heaven. And that really disturbed me. I think the preacher meant that as comfort to the family. I could tell looking at the mother and father, it brought no comfort. In my head, this is how strange I think. I'm thinking, so who's he pitching against? Is this the team from hell that he's now throwing no-hitters with? And how much fun would that just, it was really troublesome. But the reason I tell you that is this, that was no comfort. About a year later, that minister had an athlete daughter who was killed in an accident of a van. There were a number of girls on a volleyball team. There was the accident. His daughter died. And one of the things that minister did a few weeks after his own daughter's funeral is he came to the house of the parents of this young man who had died, and he said, "I'm sorry." I thought the things that I would say, had said at the funeral would be helpful to you, and now I know that they were empty words. They were the things I'd been taught to say, but until all this happened, I had no idea how those words just made the suffering worse. And so if God gives you an opportunity to be with someone who is suffering, who's hurting, don't adopt the Job's friend strategy. Instead, adopt the friend of Jesus strategy of being present and being in love and never saying, "I understand," but simply saying, "I'm here and I love you." Well, I appreciate so much your time with me today, and my prayer is that God will use you to encourage others. But also my prayer is if you're one of those who's suffering where none of it really makes sense to you, is that somehow God will give you the strength and the courage so that you can stay with Him and stay close to Him, and that maybe the day will come where this pain called suffering finds relief in Christ. God bless you, and thank you for spending time with me today.
Restore my spirit, Lord, I need restored. My heart is weary, please help me, dear Lord. I stand in need of more strength from your word. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. Revive the fire, Lord, deep in my soul. Stir my desire to work in your fold. Light in my heart, dear God, your zeal grown cold. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. Renew my courage, Lord, it needs restored. My cup is empty, refill it, dear Lord. Replace all doubts and fear with faith so bold. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. Restore my spirit, Lord, I need restored. My heart is weary, please help me, dear Lord. I stand in need of more strength from your word. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. Renew my love, rebuild my faith, oh, restore my soul. You are there, you are there, you are there, you are there. Where can I go? Where can I go from your spirit? Any place that I choose to go, you're already there. And if I go to the heavens, if I rise on the wings of dawn, if I settle by the sea, I know your hand is always there to guide me. You are there, you are there, you are there, you are there. Where can I go? Where can I go from your presence? If trouble is in my way, you're already there. You will not go from my presence. Before a word of mine is said, if in the depths I lay my head, in the shadow of your wings you're there to hide me. You are there, 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 you are there.
Hi, I'm Melissa Lancaster, and I want to welcome you to Praise and Harmony TV. Here on this app or website, whichever you're using, you'll find countless videos on how to sing, vocal care, music theory, training for individual songs, and learning harmony parts, music videos and lyric videos for your church to stream, children's content, and so much more. We are adding new content every day, so be sure to take a look around and be sure to sign up for your 3-day free trial.
All of the glory.
Announcing Praise and Harmony TV. P&H TV is the inspirational way to fill your life with music videos of brand new songs of worship and hymns. P&H TV also provides masterclass education for beginners to learn fundamentals of music, as well as the quickest method to easily learn how to sing harmony, featuring hundreds of videos which isolate one harmony voice part at a time for ease of learning.
I know the Lord will find a way for me.
Hear fascinating history of classic hymns of the faith. Enjoy videos of Christian singing group Acappella, including vintage material from the vault.
We bow down and we crown you the King.
Be blessed by full-length music videos of the International Ministry of the Praise and Harmony Singers. Share children's videos as well as songs for teens by Regen Harmony. Praise and Harmony TV also features documentaries of behind-the-scenes events, including a specialized podcast for song leaders.
There were no gods.
P&H TV contains resources for a wide variety of assemblies, including videos specifically designed for worship services, weddings, funerals, and special holiday events. New content will be added every month. Sign up today for the annual plan and save big money. Praise and Harmony TV is here.